Well, on March 23rd, 2020, the National Task Force in Sexual and Domestic Violence issued an alert with this startling coronavirus claim. I'm quoting, quote, survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault are facing extreme danger and risk, end quote. The NTF alert did not provide any evidence to support its claims. Subsequently, a plethora of media accounts predicted an imminent spike and a spurt of abuse, often featuring heart-rending but unsubstantiated anecdotes. But the predicted abuse catastrophe never happened. At least that's according to 5 separate studies. These 5 separate studies concluded that overall there was no increase in domestic violence or sexual assault, and many of the locales saw a significant decrease. So we're going to unpack today whether or not this is true. So welcome to this edition of the Military Wire with Mike Schindler. I am, in fact, Mike Schindler, and this is where we interview some of America's most elite men and women who have served this country in hopes that you, the listener, can gain something from the topic, the story, the individual's life that you can apply to your own life and move forward. And I want to thank our sponsors for this episode, Bone Frog Cellars and Bone Frog Wine, founded by my friend, Lieutenant Commander, Navy SEAL Tim Cruikshank and David Johnston. Portions of those proceeds go to the Navy SEAL Foundation to help the families of fallen SEALs. So I just want to start off by saying domestic violence is a very serious problem. It's not something to joke about. It has no boundaries of sex. It has no boundaries of economic status or education. It doesn't matter if you've served in the military and not served. This is an issue, domestic violence, that can affect and oftentimes does affect many people and sometimes people that you know. So joining me today is U.S. Army veteran Everett Bartlett, the president and founder of the Coalition to End Domestic Violence. And he's going to help shed some light on what is going on behind closed doors and how we can spot those who are suffering from domestic violence and help them get help. So Dr. Bartlett, welcome to the Military Wire, sir.
Great to see you, Mike.
Yeah, great to have you. I want to set the stage for our viewers so they understand a little bit about who you are. You received your PhD from Johns Hopkins University, former faculty member from 3 different universities, former federal regulator, the Department of Health and Human Services. You're an author of over 100 peer-reviewed articles and editorials. My gosh, I've got a lot of work to do to catch up to you. You're a proud father of 3 and an avid bicyclist. I love that. Now you're the president and founder of the Coalition to End Domestic Violence. What else did I leave out, Edward?
And I was a draftee into the U.S. Army. I'm not going to tell you what year it was because I don't want to date myself, but I spent a lot of time at Fort Polk, Louisiana. Let's just put it that way.
Got it. Fort Polk. That's one reason why I joined the Navy is because I looked at the Army installation and said, yeah, I'm not going to any of those places. So. Well, I want to get to this topic because it's pretty serious. And I know with the lockdowns, with coronavirus, with people staying at home, there was a lot of news media, people intaking a lot of different stuff, not really knowing what to believe or what not to believe. And I remember when COVID first hit front and center, Edward, there was a few reports, media that was reporting that domestic violence, suicide, alcoholism, a number of our social ills were all on the rise, and they were devastating families. And this was a pretty serious issue. And according to these studies, they're saying that domestic violence, in fact, it did not increase, it decreased. Is that true?
Absolutely, Mike. So basically, Mike, practically everything you've heard about domestic violence is either a half-truth or it's a complete lie. And let's just start with the big, you know the phrase, the big lie. So let's start out with, what is the big lie? Well, the big lie is that this is all about patriarchal power and control. Okay. So when you say patriarchal power and control, it elicits the image of a clenched fist man with his wife cowering in the corner. Well, that's just so far off the truth. The truth is that men are actually more likely to be victims of physical domestic violence than women. And that's according to the Centers for Disease Control. I can give you the exact numbers if you want. But we're talking about 5.4 million male victims compared with 4.2 female victims each year. we're talking about a pretty big disparity here. Again, men are more likely to be victims of domestic violence than women. And so going back to this quote, big lie. So part of that big lie is it's all about power and control, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, sometimes that is a factor. Let's be upfront, but more often it's things like mental health problems, alcohol abuse, childhood trauma that has not been resolved yet, like people who grew up in an abusive family, and lo and behold, they tend to repeat those patterns in adulthood. So that's really what's going on here are a series of mental health problems. Very seldom is it truly about a man or a woman trying to exert power and control. And probably the biggest, most important statistic that really shows how false this claim is that the group with the very highest rates of domestic violence are women in same-sex lesbian relationships, right? So where does patriarchal power and control fit in when you're talking about women in a lesbian relationship who are abusers or being abused?
So I want to back up because there's a lot that you there's a lot that you packed into this. So for clarity, number one, what you're saying is, according to the CDC data, there are more men than women that suffer from domestic violence, and these are at least reported numbers that we have, right? I'm sure there's
these are all self-reports, so we're not worried about police. Police, when people calling the police, this is phone calls made to individual citizens asking them in the last year, have you experienced any kind of physical abuse?
Got it. Okay. And then you say that in same-sex relationships, specifically women and women, there tends to be a higher rate of domestic violence in those relationships as opposed to men with men. Is that correct?
Correct. Substantially higher. Yes, it's pretty stunning, Mike. I'll tell you, this was an incident occurred 2 weeks ago. You may have heard about it in the news. This occurred in New York City. There was a female police officer who had been in a same-sex lesbian relationship. That relationship broke up, and so her ex then took up with another woman. So now we have a love triangle going on. The police officer came back home and discovered the other two women in bed. The police officer pulled out her revolver, fired her revolver, shot her ex-lover in the chest, and killed the other woman. This is just 2 weeks ago. But there's been this call it a shroud of silence about female-initiated abuse. This tragedy could have been averted if people had been willing to talk about this issue in a factual and comprehensive way.
Yeah, so that when we get into facts, I think we're in a point in society where people want to debate facts, right? They want to debate everything. They want to change definitions. They want to. So I want to get to this. Why would the media bury stories like this, or why would they suggest that domestic violence is on the rise? Why does the media do that? What is there political motive? Is there fundraising motive behind this? Is there we need to shape a certain narrative? I know I've given you a lot to feed off of, but what is it? Why are we not seeing these stories in the media? And why is the media reporting an increase in domestic violence? Let's start there.
So Mark, the answer is all the above. All three reasons that you just listed are true. Yes, there is a very powerful narrative. And again, that narrative is about patriarchal power and control. And yes, there's a lot of politicians that are they've sponsored domestic violence laws. The federal law is called the Violence Against Women Act, which obviously is kind of misleading or misses a big part of the picture. And yes, money definitely is a factor here because let's face it, there is a lot of chivalry in our country. And when a male lawmaker is told that, hey, women are, let's kind of connect on this coronavirus issue. So when a male lawmaker is told, oh, there are millions of women who are locked down at their homes and they are at the mercy of their abusive husbands. Well, what more powerful, image is there than that to a chivalrous lawmaker? And so, we'll talk about the studies in just a minute if you like, but
Yeah.
There has been no increase in domestic violence under COVID.
Well, let's talk about those studies, because I think this is pretty important. I mean, we hear that women are subject to more domestic violence than men. At least that's what we hear or assume. At least that's what we see in the media. So let's go to those studies, because I think it's important. I mean, one of the risks that you and I have is that we're two males talking about domestic violence, right? In a world that assumes that domestic violence essentially targets women, when what you're saying is domestic violence oftentimes impacts men more than it does women. So I can certainly see some of my audience members saying, Mike, you're defending a position because you're a target of the position, when in fact you're saying we're not defending anything. We're essentially going to the science and the numbers. Is that correct?
Yeah, and let's also be very clear, Mike, that we are being pro-female in the sense that think of all the female abusers who can't get help, who, their need and their predicament is not recognized by service providers or by society at large. And so, you look at this recent tragedy in New York City, that could have been avoided if there had been services available. So everything we're talking about is just as pro-female as it is pro-male. But basically, we want everything to be factually based, right?
Yeah. So talk to us a little bit about those studies.
Sure. Well, so Mike, you mentioned that alarmist announcement that came out in March of 2020 from a group called the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. And as you said, it was a claim, but there was no factual basis. So being sort of the guy I am, I started poking around and looking for what. I mean, they were talking literally about a spike or a spurt.
Yeah.
And like an absolutely catastrophic problem. That's how they were discussing this. So I thought, oh, okay, well, let's give it a fair shot. Let's see what the science said. Let's look at the crime report. So the first study that came out, this was a group called the Marshall Project. They're happen to be based in New York City. They're an independent investigative journalism group, and they probably lean more left than right. And the Marshall Project actually looked at 3 different cities, and all 3 cities they found declines. And I have the chart. It's on our website. It's www.end2dv.org. End2 as in TO, dv.org. And so I'm looking at their chart right now at Chicago, 23% reduction in domestic violence cases. Austin, Texas, 13% reduction. Chandler, Arizona, I believe it says a 12%. So that was sort of the first report that, oh, this isn't quite what the narrative was talking about.
So let's talk about why there's a shift, or why there's a pursuit to have this narrative of increase. Is it for this push to increase social workers in the field? Is it saying, listen, you know what, domestic violence is on the increase. The last thing we need is, an armed police officer showing up at somebody's door and escalating the situation. What we need is more therapists or more social workers to show up, and that will begin to diminish the issue. Is that a factor? Is that not a factor? It's very confusing to me why I would think that for the amount of money that we throw into strengthening relationships, that we would want to report a positive outcome, as opposed to, well, it's not working, so you need to spend more money. And maybe that's the goal. Is it all about the money?
Well, I guess I'll let the listener decide the answer to that question, but I'll present the facts. As a result of this really stunning claims of a spurt and a spike in domestic violence, Congress listened, paid attention. You may recall there was actually 2 or 3 huge COVID relief bills that went through. and I believe two of them had part of it, had money specifically for domestic violence shelters and housing, because again, remember the narrative was women are being locked up at home with their abusive husbands, and they have no way to escape the abuse. That was the narrative. So the money was allocated for to expand, to have more housing alternatives available to women who claimed they were victims of domestic violence. So I mean, sad but true, the alarmist claim worked. They got a lot of taxpayer money to address a non-existent catastrophe.
It's so interesting to me. So share with us, because you're really behind this campaign, that Tell the Truth About Domestic Violence campaign. Share with us a little bit, Edward, what that is about and why that's so important now.
Yeah, well, so there's so many just things about the domestic violence issue that makes me, wrinkle my eyebrows and stare in disbelief, in all honesty. For example, we in the federal government has spent, and this is the Violence Against Women Act that first passed in 1994. Under that law, the federal government has spent $10 billion to address domestic violence. All right. So we're talking about a lot of change here. But here's the stunning fact. There is no evidence that all of these programs have reduced the occurrence of domestic violence at all. There is no evidence, period, that, for example, a lot of these programs are focused at law enforcement, getting police to make more arrests, more prosecutions, putting more, usually they're men, putting more men in jail. But there's no evidence that these policies have actually worked. And there's actually evidence that says what's called mandatory arrests, that mandatory arrest policies have actually resulted in an increase in risk to domestic violence victims. So again, shake your head if you want, but this is really what's happening. It shows how powerful the narrative is.
So yeah, it's extremely powerful. And I think, I think what Elon Musk just came out and said, hey, if you can give me a good plan to end, hunger with my $6 billion, I'll sell my stock and end it tomorrow, right? So here we're talking about any domestic violence. The studies claim that the domestic violence went down during coronavirus. What can we attribute to the numbers going down?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's kind of two ways to look at, the relationships of men and women, and you kind of alluded to it a few minutes ago. So if you view men and women as their interests are inherently antagonistic, that their interests are fundamentally opposed to each other, hey, it kind of makes sense that if they're spending more time together, tempers are more likely to flare, there'll be more abuse, right?
Right.
But there's another way to look at it. The other way is, hey, the interests of men and women are fundamentally aligned. They're fundamentally the same or very similar. And actually there was one study, and I can actually quote you the chapter and verse, that was done by the Center for the Study of Elections and Democracy. Again, it's on our website. Did a survey of people and asked about what has been the effect of the COVID lockdown policies on family relationships. And fasten your seatbelt, Mike, because I'm going to tell you what they said. The answers were 56% of the survey respondents said that experiencing the pandemic, quote, has made me appreciate my partner more. And 47% agreed that the coronavirus, quote, has deepened my commitment to my relationship, right? Wow. So that speaks worlds about, men and women's interests are fundamentally aligned. And so that explains why in some cases domestic violence went down, because, hey, men and women, husband and wife were spending more time together and talking through their issues and getting to know each other and like each other more.
Yeah, see, that's so good. Well, I think, when you start to pull relationships back together, right, instead of living separate lives, you begin to figure out, number one, I like this person. Number two, I can talk through my issues. And I think that's pretty important. How do we recognize domestic violence, though, Edward? I mean, it's a real problem. We know it's a problem in America. We know it happens. How can we recognize it? And is it my responsibility to report it if I see it?
Yeah. So by domestic violence, we're normally referring to physical domestic violence. So
Yeah.
it could be, relatively minor incidents like throwing a pillow at your partner. Okay. Or, but, and that's the more common. Okay. It's a one-time incident where there's no physical harm. If a woman slaps her husband on the face, that's considered at the lower range of severity if it's one time. On the other hand, if it's using a weapon or threatening to use a weapon, whether it's a knife, a kitchen knife, a gun, or any other weapon, or strangling the person or tempting, those are clearly the more severe forms of domestic violence. So in some cases, the severe forms do leave a physical mark, bruises,
Mm.
contusions. Other times not. So for the less severe forms, it's not always easy to recognize what happened.
Yeah, it's interesting. I throwing pillows. I was thinking, geez, my wife and I sometimes have pillow fights. So I guess, I guess we got to be careful, right? We're doing it with the right motivation. So,
Yeah.
um,
Well, if it's
yeah,
consensual, you're fine.
yeah, that's good. So your organization, Coalition to End Domestic Violence, how can people get involved with the work that you're doing? And I want to stress that this is not, the stuff that you're doing is not opinion. You went to Johns Hopkins. You've got 100 peer-reviewed articles and research papers, and you really dive into the facts and the methodologies and the numbers behind things. So I want people to understand that this is not voodoo science at all, that you're dealing really in a very factual world, and it might go against the narrative, but that doesn't change the facts. So how do people get involved with your organization? What can they do to help and be a part of it?
Yeah, so Mike, we are a policy organization. We're trying to make the laws better. So we work with lawmakers, staffers, both at the federal and state levels. We're very concerned about how all of these policies have been especially harmful to Black men.
Mm.
And we could talk about that if you want to. But so we we work with lawmakers trying to make the policies more effective. And so talking about, hey, this is not simply men beating up on their wives. It's a much broader and more complicated issue than what the narrative says. So so we're not a service organization. We don't have a hotline. We
Yeah.
don't have support groups, anything like that. So if any of your listeners want to be involved at the state level, especially with our domestic violence policy efforts, we have a very active state level policy agenda.
Well, and I'm sure they would want to. And so your website, Coalition to End Domestic Violence. What is your website?
Yeah, it's www.end2dv.org. I'll say it again. So it's end2 as in TO, DV as in domestic violence.org.
Yeah, that's great. And I do encourage people to visit. It's been enlightening for me, because I think I was probably one of the ones that originally parroted. And I'll just say this, when the media first hit, we really got to be cautious about domestic violence. It seems to be in a spike. Reading the headlines, and I think we all probably fall victim to reading headlines and believing everything that we read. And what you're saying is that there's much more behind this, that people need to spend time to use discernment, get educated. Don't always believe what we hear in the media. There's often ulterior motives for that. If there was one thing you would want our listeners to really remember from this interview, Edward, what would that be?
Wow, great question, Mike. I think what I'd like people to remember is that domestic violence is not a gender issue. In other words, it's not, about this patriarchal power control. It's not a gender issue. It's a human issue. It affects, all races, all ages, all groups. But some groups definitely have higher rates, especially the lesbian same-sex groups have higher rates.
Well, I just want to say thank you for being on the Military Wire, Dr. Bartlett. It's very educational. I hope people dig in. I hope people understand that, the key is in relationship to really be talking through the issues, and, taking time outs, right? I mean, I'm there's moments that we have to walk away and then revisit something when we have cooler heads, because it is a very real issue. But to your point, I love that it's not a gender issue, it's a human issue. And if we can talk through our issues as humans, respecting the other person, I think we can make headway on this instead of spending $10 billion and seeing the issues still survive. So Dr. Bartlett, thank you for being on the Military Wire.
My pleasure, Mike.
Yeah, thank you. And for those of you who are looking to discover your new mission, purpose, identity after service, be sure to check us out at Operation Military Family. And again, be sure you visit Dr. Bartlett's website. I think that's so important. Get yourself educated. That's all for now.